In the year of 39, assembled here the volunteers. In the days when lands were few, here the ship sailed out, cross blue and sunny morn, sweetest sight ever seen. So, that was actually a Queen song called 39, written and sung by their lead guitarist, now Dr. Brian May. Which is interesting considering Freddie Mercury usually sings all of the band's songs. This song was special to Brian May because at this point in his life, he was leaving behind his doctorate in astrophysics to pursue a career as a rock star, at the great disapproval of his father, who felt like he was throwing his life away. This song was a sort of autobiography for him, in the form of a mini science fiction story about time dilation, which is actually part of Einstein's theory of relativity, which states, as speed increases, time expands. Long after his Queen heyday, however, he finished his PhD in astrophysics at Imperial College London 30 years later. And now, not only is he one of the world's greatest guitarists, he's also an astrophysicist to boot. So, I tell you Dr. Brian May's story because he isn't an isolated case of a scientist with a penchant for creative pursuits. There were and are many scientists in our history who tell the same tale. In fact, I can tell you a similar story. Sure, I'm just another A-level student, and as for now, maybe I'm just another aspiring scientist, a biotechnologist hopefully. But aside from my unwavering passion for bioscience, I'm deeply in love with poetry and music. I've been equally fascinated with science and music for as long as I can remember, which was probably at age 4. I would pore over science encyclopedias with pictures, have posters of the human anatomy, and even a huge poster of the periodic table, which I still have on my bedroom wall to this day. But that was also a period of time where I discovered I could sing. My mother tells stories of how I memorized almost every ABBA song, and how I sang Dancing Queen as if I truly was the Dancing Queen. Oh, and get this, when I was 10, my mother jokingly asked me to sing an opera song, and I was like, sure, why not? Let's give it a try. And to everyone's surprise, including and especially mine, I could. And from then on, I've been singing opera and performing it whenever I can. However, this duality of mine has been at war for many years. Growing up, I always knew I had to pick a side when the time came for me to choose what to study in university and a career to commit to. My parents, as supportive of my talents as they were, felt as if a kid with my potential should opt for a scientific career instead. I didn't disagree with them, but I felt as if by choosing science, I'd be saying goodbye to such an integral part of my identity. In addition, over time, I soon realized my almost natural ability to write poetry. And this all began when my parents gifted me my first journal at 10. And I've been obsessed with the written word since. Every journal entry was some sort of poem or short prose, though my poetry was much more lighthearted back then, reflecting the bubbly child I was. You see, poetry was my language when I couldn't comprehend my emotions. Poetry allowed me to hide behind a veil of metaphor when I was afraid. Therefore, I felt dissonant when it came to confronting my creative side, because for years I thought that my love for poetry and music directly contrasted my passion for science, or even discredited science as it is technical, as opposed to poetry, which allows for freedom of expression. Now, here I am facing this dilemma of mine. But I've discovered that science and poetry, get this, are actually fundamentally the same. Sure, you might tell me, what defines science and poetry are so different? How could they be even remotely similar? Science is defined as knowledge acquired by study, while poetry is defined as imaginative or creative literature. And the differences between them are like the gap between a work of fiction and non-fiction. No one would ever think poetry could have anything common with science because it's so often colored by romanticization, metaphor, and hyperbole. Not quite. You see, the fact of the matter is, poetry was the first written way we address such questions, like, what is the world made of? Or, how was the universe created? A bit of a history lesson here, but in the 5th and 6th centuries BC, scholars reworked these questions, writing on physics, chemistry, and astronomy, and often in verse, which means in lines of poetry. Science was born in poetry. And with a more relevant issue to our times, poetry can help communicate science. Science communication is educating and increasing the sense of wonder about scientific discoveries to everyday people. Most times, when there are poets who write about science, it's only a mention here and there about scientific terms. But with poetry, there is hope that we can maybe break down the barriers that separate the experts from the rest of us. And I think I speak for most of us when it feels as if there's a disconnect between us and scientists when it comes to knowing about the latest news. And even when publicized in the media, this divide exists as there is barely sufficient communication to even understand the significance of it. But with poetry, scientists can express their emotions, and the public can express their opinions. This creates a sense of shared vulnerability, a reminder that scientists are also a member of society. In fact, other than Brian May, there are so many other scientists who use poetry to communicate their work or even solve problems that arose in their research. As a woman in STEM myself, Ada Lovelace's story captured my attention. Ada Lovelace, who is also known as the first computer programmer, was a scientist poet, and she also had a parent who disapproved of her creative tendencies. Her mother wasn't a fan of her potentially following in her famous father's footsteps, who maybe some of you know as the famous poet Lord Byron. In response, she said, "If you can't give me poetry, can't you give me poetical science?" She used poetry to give her insight into mathematics and in creating the analytical engine, which is also known as the ancestor to the computer. So, when you ponder the question once again, science and poetry both have the common goal of finding ways to make sense of our world. Science and poetry are in its essence equals, as it's basically a way of communication. Where science is a way to communicate scientific findings, poetry is a way to communicate emotion, stories, and experience. Through my journey of self-discovery, the conflict with my identity, and even questioning of my life's purpose, I now understand how scientists use poetry to have a deeper understanding of their work, while communicating science to the general public in a more engaging fashion. As for me, I will keep writing poetry to make sense of what I learned in biology and chemistry, until I too can call myself a scientist poet. Thank you very much.